I want to be careful about how I tell this story, because it involves real people with real faith, and those people deserve to be treated with the same seriousness they bring to their own lives. Snake-handling churches are real. They exist in Southwest Virginia, and in West Virginia, and in Eastern Kentucky, and in parts of Tennessee and North Carolina. There are perhaps 125 congregations still practicing in the United States today. They handle venomous serpents, copperheads, timber rattlesnakes, cottonmouths during worship services, as an act of faith, in obedience to a passage in the 16th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. They are not a joke. They are not a spectacle. They are not ignorant or deluded or performing for the entertainment of outsiders. They are people who believe, with a depth of sincerity that most of us will never feel about anything, that their faith is sufficient to protect them from harm. Some of them have been bitten. Some of them have died. They do not stop. They believe what they believe, and they practice what they believe, and they deserve the dignity of being understood on their own terms. I say all of this first because what I am about to describe is something different. Something that looked like those churches from the outside, something that had learned the language and the music and the structure of those churches well enough to pass, but was not a church, and was not worshiping anything that has a name in any scripture. A photojournalist named Della found it on a Saturday night in September. She was in the third pew when she understood what she was looking at. By then, the doors were already closed. This is the congregation. Bow your head.
Della was 36 years old, a freelance photojournalist based in Bristol, Virginia, with a 10-year career that had taken her from conflict zones in 3 countries to the rural communities of her own region, which she had come to believe were as little understood by the wider world as any foreign war. 3 years before this happened, she had begun what she called the Signs Project, a long-form documentary effort to photograph the snake-handling holiness churches of the Central Appalachians with the respect and access that the subject had rarely received from outside media. She had spent 18 months building trust before she ever raised a camera inside a service. She had eaten at kitchen tables and attended funerals, and helped move furniture, and driven elderly church members to medical appointments, and had simply been present, repeatedly and patiently, until the communities she was documenting understood that she was not there to make them look dangerous or strange or pitiable. She had been to 41 services across 6 states by the September this story takes place. She had photographed serpent handlers in full religious ecstasy, the faces of people in genuine transport, lit from within by something she could not name but had learned to recognize. She had enormous respect for what she was documenting, and it showed in the work, and the work had begun to attract serious attention. She had also, by this point, developed relationships with several church elders and pastors who had begun referring her to other congregations, other communities, other keepers of the tradition who might be willing to be documented. That was how she got the invitation from Brother Aldous Trent. Aldous Trent was 71 years old, a deacon at a church in Wise County that Della had been photographing for 8 months. He was a quiet man, deeply respected in his community, the kind of elder whose authority derived entirely from the quality of his character rather than any formal position. She trusted him. She had come to trust him the way you trusted someone who had given you no reason not to over a long period of time. He told her about the other church on a Thursday evening in September, sitting on his porch after a midweek service. He said, "There is a congregation that meets in the woods above Caney Branch on the 2nd Saturday of each month. They have been meeting there for as long as anyone in the county can remember." He did not know the name of the church. It had no name that was shared with outsiders. He did not know the name of the pastor. He had been once himself, years ago, invited by someone he had trusted, and he had not gone back. She asked him why he had not gone back. He was quiet for a long time. "The service was not like ours," he said. "The form was familiar, the words were right, but what was in that room was not what I recognize as the Spirit." He folded his hands in his lap. "I don't know what it was. I've prayed on it for 30 years and I don't have an answer. But I know what I felt in that room, and I know what I feel in my own church, and they were not the same thing." She asked him why he was telling her about it now, after 30 years. He looked at her with an expression she would think about for a long time afterward. "Because someone asked me to," he said. "Someone told me you were coming and asked me to give you the invitation." "Who?" she asked. He told her he did not know the name, that a man had come to his door, a stranger, and asked him to give the invitation to the photographer who was documenting the churches. Did you get a good look at him? Good enough, Aldous said. He looked at his hands. He knew things about you he should not have known. The names of your family, the name of the project, the names of the churches you had visited. A pause. He was very still when he stood at my door, the way water is still just before it moves. Della drove home that night with her notebook and the directions written on a piece of paper in Aldis's careful handwriting, and she lay awake for a long time before she decided she was going. She was a journalist. This was her work. She told herself that, and she believed it, and she went. The directions took her off paved road onto gravel, and off gravel onto a dirt track, and off the dirt track onto what was barely a track at all. 2 ruts through tall grass on a hillside above a creek. She parked where the ruts ended at a wire gate and walked the last quarter-mile by flashlight through second-growth timber, following the sound before she could see the light. The sound was singing. She had heard congregational singing in 41 churches across 6 states, and she recognized its shape even from a distance, the unaccompanied unison of a small group of voices finding the same note by feel, the way voices did when they had been singing together for a very long time. There was a piano somewhere, an old one, slightly out of tune. The building resolved out of the dark as she came up the hill, a small, white-framed church, the paint weathered to gray in places, a single light burning in each of the 2 windows flanking the door, a hand-lettered sign above the door that she could not read from the path. 6 or 7 vehicles parked in the clearing beside it, all old, all local. She had arrived at services like this dozens of times. She knew how to enter, unhurried, respectful, camera bag over one shoulder, finding a seat in the back and making herself small and quiet until the congregation had determined that she was not a threat. She pushed open the door and went in. The interior was what she expected. Plain wooden pews, a low platform at the front with a pulpit and a piano, and 2 mismatched chairs for the musicians. Kerosene lanterns on the windowsills supplementing the single overhead bulb. A hand-painted scripture verse on the wall behind the pulpit. The congregation was smaller than she'd expected. 14 people, she counted. 9 women, 5 men, ranging in age from what she estimated as the mid-30s to quite elderly. Plain clothing, no jewelry. The stillness of people who had been sitting in the presence of something they took seriously for a long time. They did not turn when she entered. 2 or 3 people glanced at her with expressions she could not read, then returned their attention to the front. A man in the second pew slid left to make room. She took the offered space and settled in. The pastor was at the pulpit, a tall, thin man, older, in a dark suit that was slightly too large for him, with the kind of long-boned, angular face that she associated with long hours outdoors in difficult weather. He was reading scripture. His voice was low and steady, and she did not immediately recognize the passage, which was unusual. She knew the Bible well enough by now to place most passages within a few words. She listened for a moment. The language was right. The cadence was right. The words were biblical words arranged in biblical syntax. But the passage was not one she knew. She reached for her phone to search it and found she had no signal. She put the phone away and listened. The service proceeded as she expected. Scripture, then prayer, then music, then more scripture. The piano player was a heavy-set woman in her 60s who played with confident, institutional authority, and the congregation sang without hesitation, which told her these were the hymns they always sang, not ones selected for the occasion. She began to photograph. She worked the way she always worked, quietly, slowly, no flash, letting the available light do what it could. The faces of the congregation in the lantern glow, the hands of the piano player on the keys, the pastor at the pulpit, head bowed in prayer. Then the sermon ended, and the boxes came out. She had seen the boxes in 41 churches, wooden, latched, handled with the particular careful respect owed to what was inside. She positioned herself to the side of the platform the way she always did and raised her camera. The pastor took the first box from a young man who had carried it from the back of the room, and he held it in both hands, and he raised his face, and he opened it. Della looked through her viewfinder, and she lowered her camera, and she took one step back, and then another. She is careful about how she describes what she saw. She has described it to me twice, and both times she has used the same words, which tells me she has spent a great deal of time arriving at the most accurate language she can find. She says, there was something in the box, something living, something that moved the way a serpent moved, the same liquid boneless motion, the same weight-shifting coil, but it was not a serpent. She says the proportions were wrong, too large for a box that size, in a way that she could not resolve. It was as if what was inside occupied more space than the box should have been able to contain, or as if she was having difficulty perceiving the actual dimensions of the thing, the way you had difficulty resolving a visual illusion until the trick was revealed. She says it was dark, not patterned the way a timber rattlesnake was patterned, not marked the way a copperhead was marked. A uniform darkness, slightly iridescent, that moved and shifted with the thing's movement. She says it did not behave the way a serpent behaved in a handler's hands. Serpents during handling, she had seen hundreds of them, were typically calm or agitated in ways she understood. They moved toward or away from the handler's warmth. They were alert. They were alive in the way animals were alive. This moved as if it were responding to something she could not perceive. This moved as if it knew exactly where it was and what it was doing. She says the pastor held it and his face changed. Not the way a handler's face changed during the ecstasy of a successful serpent handling, the openness, the surrender, the transport that she had learned to recognize after 3 years. His face changed the way a face changed when it received something, when it was filled from outside. She says it was not the face of a man receiving the grace of God. She says, I cannot tell you what it was the face of. I do not have the word. The second box, the third, the fourth. Each one opened, each one handled, each member of the congregation taking their turn with a matter-of-factness that told her this was as ordinary for them as any other element of worship. The thing from each box different in size, perhaps different in nature, she could not be certain, but sharing the quality she had identified in the first, purposeful, aware, moving as if in response to something she could not sense. She was pressing her back against the rear wall of the church by the fourth box. Nobody was looking at her. That was the thing she kept coming back to, she told me. In 41 services, the congregation always knew where she was. They were always aware of the outsider, especially during the most sacred portions of the service. It was not hostility. It was the natural attention you paid to someone whose presence was unusual in a moment of spiritual intensity. Nobody in this congregation had looked at her since the boxes came out. They were all looking at the front. All 14 of them, absolutely focused on the platform, on the boxes, on the things being handled. All 14. Della counted again. 14. The same number she had counted when she sat down. She counted the people on the platform, the people in the pews, the piano player, the pastor. 14. She was not in that count. She was against the back wall, separate from the congregation, outside the circle of lantern light. She looked at the door. The door had no interior handle. She is a calm person. It is essential to her work, and she has cultivated it deliberately over 10 years of going to difficult places with a camera. She does not panic. She assesses. The door had no interior handle, but it had hinges. Old hinges. If the wood of the doorframe had swelled in the September damp, and it had rained the previous day, she remembered the rain. The hinges might be stiff, but a door with swelled wood could be forced. She had forced doors before. The congregation was entirely focused forward. No one was watching her. The distance from her position at the back wall to the door was perhaps 15 feet. She began to move along the wall toward the door, and the pastor looked up from the platform and met her eyes across the full length of the room. He did not call out. He did not gesture. He did not stop what he was doing. The thing in his hands continued its slow, deliberate movement, and he continued to hold it, looking at her. He smiled. It was not a warm smile or a cold smile. It was the smile of someone whose expectation had been confirmed. The smile of a host who had been waiting for a guest to arrive at precisely the moment they had known the guest would arrive. Della put her shoulder against the door and pushed. It moved. The wood was swelled, the hinges were stiff, but it moved. An inch, 2 inches, and the cold September air came through the gap, and she pushed harder, and the door scraped open wide enough to pass through, and she went through it without looking back. She walked down the hill in the dark without her flashlight. She had dropped it somewhere in the church, she didn't remember when, navigating by the feel of the ground under her feet and the faint ambient glow of the overcast sky. And she found her car by the wire gate and got in and drove. She did not stop until she reached the state route. She sat at the junction with the engine running and her hands on the wheel, and she breathed for a long time. Then she checked her camera. The photographs were wrong. Not corrupted, not technically failed, not blurred by motion or blown out by light. The exposures were correct. The focus was correct. The church interior was documented with the precise, careful quality she brought to all her work. But the boxes were empty in every photograph. She had photographed each box as it was opened, and in every image the box interior was dark and vacant. No movement, no creature, nothing. The pastor's hands were cupped in the correct holding position, his face showing the changed expression she had struggled to describe. The congregation watched with complete attention. The boxes were empty. Whatever she had seen with her eyes, her camera had seen nothing. She looked at the photographs for a long time. Then she scrolled to the last photograph she had taken before she began moving toward the door. It was a wide shot of the congregation from the back of the room, the 14 people on the pews and the platform lit by lantern light, all facing forward. She was in the photograph. She was in the third pew among the congregation, seated with her hands in her lap and her face turned to the front, her expression the same focused, directed attention as everyone around her. She had not sat in the third pew. She had sat in the second pew briefly and then moved to the back wall. She had never sat with her hands in her lap and her face turned to the front, because from the moment the boxes came out, she had been pressed against the back wall trying to reach the door. The photograph showed 15 people, 14 congregation members, and Della, seated among them, looking forward, looking at the platform, her face holding an expression she did not recognize as her own. She went to Aldous Trent at 7 in the morning. He was already awake, already on his porch as if he had been waiting. She showed him the photographs on her camera screen without saying anything. He looked at them for a long time. He lingered on the last one, the congregation photograph, the 15 people, Della in the third pew. "I should not have given you the invitation," he said. "You said someone asked you to." "I should not have done it, even so. I'm old enough to know that some doors should not be opened regardless of who holds them out." He handed the camera back. "I am sorry." "What is that congregation?" she asked. "What are they handling?" He was quiet for a long time. The September morning was cool and damp, and the ridge above his house was just catching the first light. "I don't know what they are handling," he said. "I have never known. There are older people in this county who have older names for it. I have heard it called the Old Covenant. I have heard it called the First Church, meaning not the first Christian church, but the first anything, the first worship, the oldest act of whatever it is people were doing before there was a name for it." He paused. "There are people in the mountains who believe that the holiness tradition, the signs, the serpents, the gifts of the Spirit, that those things are echoes of something that came before, that the worship came first and the theology came after to explain what people were already doing, had already been doing since before anyone was keeping account." He looked at his hands. "And that the congregation on Caney Branch is where whatever came before has always met, without the theology, without the doctrine, without anything but the oldest act." "What did they want with me?" Della asked. "What any congregation wants with a visitor," Aldous said. "To be witnessed, to be documented." He looked at her. You photograph churches for a living. You have spent 3 years learning how to capture the sacred on film. A pause. They wanted you to do that for them. The camera didn't capture anything. The boxes were empty in every photograph. The boxes were empty in every photograph, he agreed. But you are shown on film, and you are in the third pew among them, facing the front. That is the documentation they wanted, not of themselves, of you, among them, as one of them. The morning light moved down the ridge. I left. I pushed the door open and I left. Yes, Aldous said. The photograph was taken before I left. I was at the back wall when that photograph was taken. I had not sat in the third pew. Yes, he said again. Then how? Della, his voice was gentle and very serious. I need you to ask you something, and I need you to think about it before you answer. Not the answer you want to give, the honest answer. She waited. When you were against the back wall, he said, and the pastor looked at you and smiled, in the moment before you pushed the door, was any part of you considering not pushing it? The morning was very quiet. Della Crane looked at her hands. She did not answer for a long time. She deleted the photographs, all of them, the entire Signs Project folder, 3 years of work, 41 churches, thousands of images representing the most significant documentary work of her career. She did it in the parking lot of a gas station outside Wise, sitting in her car with the engine running, and she did not hesitate once she started. The last photograph went last. 15 people in a lantern-lit church, 14 congregation members, Della in the third pew. She held her finger over the delete confirmation for a full minute. Then she deleted it. She drove home and she did not return to Wise County for the rest of that year. She came back to the Signs Project eventually, slowly, carefully, rebuilding the access and the trust she had spent 3 years earning. She is still working on it. The work is still serious and still respectful, and the photographs are still extraordinary. She has not been back to Caney Branch. She has not tried to find the unnamed church or its congregation again. She does not know whether the deleting the photographs made a difference. She does not know whether the congregation got what it wanted, its documentation, its witness, its outsider seated in the third pew among them, before she pushed the door open. She does not know whether the photograph was a record of something that had already happened or a record of something they intended to make happen. She has told me one other thing which she has not told anyone else. In the weeks after Caney Branch, she sometimes dreamed about the service. Not nightmares, not frightening dreams, ordinary dreams, in which she was sitting in the third pew of a small white church in the woods, and the lanterns were lit, and the piano was playing, and the pastor was at the pulpit, and she was at peace the way you were at peace in a place where you had always meant to be. The dreams have faded. Mostly. But twice in the last year she has woken in the night with the smell of kerosene lantern smoke in the room, sharp and specific and unmistakable, and a certainty, ebbing as wakefulness returned, that she had just been somewhere, and that it had been the second Saturday of the month. There is a church on a hill above Caney Branch in Wise County, Virginia. It has no name that is shared with outsiders. It has no address, no website, no denominational affiliation. It does not appear in any directory of mountain holiness congregations. But it has been there for a very long time. Longer than the holiness tradition, longer than the churches in the area, longer perhaps than any formal act of worship that anyone in these mountains was aware of practicing. It meets on the second Saturday of each month. It is very small. 14 people. 14 plus whoever they have invited. The signs following tradition teaches that those with true faith can handle serpents and come to no harm. What the congregation on Caney Branch handles is not harmed by faith.
What the congregation on Caney Branch handles does not require your faith. What the congregation on Caney Branch handles only requires your presence. If you are ever in Wise County, Virginia, and someone you trust hands you a piece of paper with directions written in careful handwriting, and you notice that whoever handed it to you seems to know more about you than they should, don't follow the directions. Don't go to the service. And if you do go, if you find yourself pushing through a wire gate in the dark, following the sound of singing up a hill, don't sit in the third pew. If the congregation settled into you tonight the way I hoped it would, in that quiet, specific place where the sacred and the wrong become indistinguishable, leave me a comment. Tell me what you think was in those boxes. Tell me whether you think Della made the right choice at that door. I read every one. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay with us, right here, by this fire, in the dark. Good night. Lock your doors. And if you dream tonight of a small white church on a hill, do not open the door. Whatever is waiting inside has already been waiting a very long time. A little longer won't trouble it.